Hey everybody, it's your friend Adam. I'm here with another Wednesday debate. And the debate topic is once again objective morality. But we decided to mix it up a bit because everyone's heard my argument a million times. And Brendan was nice enough to relinquish my affirmative or take over my affirmative position. So we changed it to is morality subjective, putting him into the affirmative position and allowing him to go first. He's done more preparation than me. I feel like all of my debates are kind of preparation for this argument. I made it again and again and again, and I'm trying to hone in on ways to find contradictions in the other person's position, because I've discovered now that I'm going to these debates completely incorrectly. I'm going in honest. That's like a honest interlocutor who wants to actually discern the truth. And it's not about discerning the truth. It's about beating people up online. So instead of doing that, I'm going to destroy Brendan here. I mean, he's going to go on the affirmative. I'm going to find contradictions in his argument. I'm going to zig and zag. I'm going to bring my argument in, and by the end of this debate, you guys are all going to believe in objective morality. But it's a different objective morality, because I know that the theists have their own objective morality, and mine is based in science. So anyway, I will. Brendan, do you have a YouTube channel, don't you?
Oh yeah, the philosophy guy.
Okay, the philosophy guy.
You want to check that out?
I didn't put a link in the description below. I've been busy working on videos all day, but I will update the description, and his and Drew's, our trusty moderator Drew, will be in the description below. But I will turn the floor over to you, and you can put your subjective morality argument forward.
Will do, and thank you for having me. So we'll start off with the fun part, of course, which is kind of clarifying terms, just to kind of make sure we're on the, I guess you could say, level playing field. So like the first term is morality. Whenever you're talking about morality, we should probably define like what we mean by that, which I would define it as like this principle of concerning the distinction between right and wrong, good and bad behavior, the claim that some value is better than another or something like that. So these are value judgments held by individuals and societies. They're a proclamation of what is right or wrong. So like, and then you have to define, since we're doing subjective versus objective morality, we have to define what an objective claim is. And that is more of a claim as it's a claim or statement that can be proven true or false. So then, of course, you have subjective claims, and these are claims that are not factual in relation to the universe. They don't exist outside the individual. So if humans disappeared, our subjective claims would disappear with it. So these subjective claims are kind of they're expressions of an individual's beliefs, opinions, or personal preferences, maybe even desires, depending on how we want to define it. So then kind of like transitioning here into what is kind of subjective morality. And I'm going off a little bit of what Adam has done in previous videos, and I feel like your channel probably generally knows your positions. So I'm hoping I kind of get you right. Adam seems to be a more realist, where you kind of align with this kind of anti-realist position, whereas I'd align with more of this anti-realist position that claims morality is subjective, meaning morality is a human construct that can be altered, changed, molded, impressed upon. I'll try to explain that further in a bit and throughout the debate. But I think I kind of need to critique the idea of a objective morality to hopefully kind of force you kind of to accept my conclusion of subjective morality. So this is where we get into the idea behind this fact and value gap, the subjective versus objective claims, the great kind of moral divide that we're basically talking about here today, and the idea where you cannot derive an ought from an is. And that's made famous, of course, by David Hume. So like going back to before this, the subjective claims are ought statements like I described, and ought statements directly relate to the idea of subjectivity, where objective claims can be verified, and once they are objective facts, they are kind of part of the universe, or like once we observe them, they were kind of always there. And we cannot make objective moral claims part of the universe is kind of we cannot make subjective moral claims part of the universe. And then I like to always bring up Sam Harris, because he's kind of the most commonly known for proclaiming that he overcame the is-ought problem. And spoiler, he definitely failed. So let's take the claim that most people would accept, the idea that we shouldn't maximize misery for everyone, for example. So while I agree with this claim, we shouldn't, and I would argue for it, I'd debate for it, people who go against it, but this doesn't make the statement an intrinsic part of the universe. And I want to bring up Sam Harris because, like I said, he has this influence, a large portion of the secular community that continue to defend objective morality, and kind of I want people to consider these statements. So the universe is expanding, kind of agree upon that. Humans and chimps share a common ancestor. And then we should decrease unnecessary human suffering. Those are three separate statements. So most people would agree with all three of those statements. They would call them true, or at least true in some sense. But are they true in the same sense? No. So the first two are scientific in the sense that they could have been false. If we lived in the universe that wasn't expanding, we could observe and verify that to determine if it's true. So we can imagine a universe that we lived in that humans and chimps didn't share a common ancestor. We could observe and verify that objectively. So the point is the first two statements can be updated based on the information that we take in, we learn from the universe that we live in. So now the last statement, decreasing unnecessary human suffering, what experiment can we run to determine if we should or should not decrease human suffering? We can't. It's because this is a subjective value claim, and it's a big assumption. Now we can discuss, determine, and evaluate methods of reaching a certain goal, a preference, or desire of decreasing unnecessary human suffering. But this is independent of the original ought statement. So determine the best way to objectively fulfill your ought statement does not make the ought statement objectively part of the universe. And me hitting home the distinction is important here. So is ought, because the natural world doesn't pass judgment. That's kind of like the point of why you can't derive it. It doesn't guide, it doesn't plan, and it definitely doesn't care about what we feel ought to happen. That's just like the reality we live in. So we ourselves can pass judgment about the world, other society, how the world should be run, how society should be organized. Like we can debate that and discuss that, sure. But the subjective nature of those judgments are going to make it the case that different people are going to end up with different judgments, preferences, beliefs, or opinions. So it's like the famous, there's like this famous painter example where they proclaim that they can create the color yellow, boasting that he could mix red and white together to make yellow. But when he mixed the red and white paint, pink came out. So he said he will sharpen the color up by a bit by putting in some yellow paint. And sure enough, the color began turning yellow as you do that. So the painter's move is the same problem facing the is-ought problem. They sneak in the ought statement often and proclaim like this is morality, even though they snuck in that ought claim to try to get around the is-ought problem. So we continue to see this today with science, where we claim that we can agree on condition X, that society desires the world, say, for example, to make the world a better place. And then they follow up, science can tell us how to achieve this condition or this value. And then therefore we have to do what science tells us. You see, so the ought was snuck into the statement by proclaiming that we ought to make the world a better place. That's the assumption that we cannot verify with certainty, and it's not part of the universe. And I want to remind people that I get it. Like, these realities can be hard to accept. Subjective morality, like people who can just go around doing whatever they want. So you want morality grounded in the world somehow. Like, I get that desire. Like, I have that same pull. I used to be all for objective morality. So, but like, what's true? So what to be certain of. But what we have as reality is what happens in the world, the universe and the laws of physics. It all follows a certain order. That's what we have to work with. And morality is built upon that. So an extension of what is, we come up with moral theories from what we know about the universe, such as the experience of suffering, and then thinking, oh, hey, this sucks. We should try to prevent this, right? So my point from this is that just because morality is subjective, it's still grounded in some sense in the reality we are forced to live by. Morality will always exist. So humans still desire, like, for say, let me think, like peace, order, a sense of freedom, purpose. that should make you feel comfortable accepting the reality that, like the objective reality, the objective truth that morality is subjective and the world doesn't have moral judgments. And I'll leave it to you, Adam.
Okay, it seems to me that your argument, you're basically looking around the world and you're saying that there is a bunch of different behaviors, a bunch of different ways of acting, and you're saying since different people have different ways of behaving, different preferences for what is right and wrong, that those individuals are subjectively interpreting courses of action. Now, I agree that there is subjectivity when you're taking on a moral framework, but I would argue that the value of different behaviors is only uncertain because we don't necessarily know all of the variables, all of the potential outcomes. So once you nail down exactly what the goal is, the strategy for achieving that goal can vary. But I would argue that the reason I believe morality is objective is because the actual goal is always the same, and it's grounded in an evolutionary argument. I came up, you mentioned the is-ought divide, and the ought in the is-ought divide is really, how ought we behave, but I think the answer to that will always be X, if we knew that X always produced the result that we wanted, which is some variant of increased well-being for ourselves and our immediate kin, our society further out. So in order for you to say that morality is subjective, you have to say wild things like, there are people out there and civilizations and tribes or collectives or groups or whatever you want to call them that actually would prefer to have less well-being or be in a less healthy situation, be in a less reproductive situation over time, a less viable situation over time. If we trace all of our goals back to this evolutionary route, then all of a sudden things around us that would seem subjective automatically become objective. It's almost a way of crossing that is-ought divide, and it's one of the reasons that I became so interested in Jordan Peterson, because I sense that this was kind of where he's going. I pulled out this example, and I had tweeted it out about the value of diamonds. I'll read my tweet. It says, if diamonds provide a tangible sexual selection advantage, that advantage is objective and measurable. And I use the example of birds because birds also do this. Birds who create elaborate nests, they collect certain rare objects that provide them a mating advantage. That mating advantage in birds is measurable. We would measure it. We would call it objective. For some reason in human beings, we don't call it objective because different people have place different value on diamonds. But arguably, it's this objective sexual selection advantage that diamonds have in the real world that ultimately their value is based on. This is why people compete to have them, compete to own them. This is why we can say we can come to an agreement on the value of a particular commodity. So I don't see how you can say this kind of emergent value of different commodities, diamonds, gold, even behaviors, like the value of trust or the value of not being a murderer or not living close to murderers. I don't see how you can say these values are completely subjective. If you were dropped into a society and your subjective preference was to kill people indiscriminately, you're going to be rounded up. That is an objective fact of most societies, and you're going to be killed or incarcerated. I don't see how you can get around those objective facts about the natural world simply by saying that morality is somehow subjective.
Yeah. So, so in response to that, I would say, so it seems like you're basing, and I do guess I have a couple questions too to make sure I clarify your point. It seems as though you're so basically you admit through evolution, which I would admit this too. Like we follow certain desires and preferences and such like that. And maybe you would say like our evolutionary drive is towards survival and then also reproduction. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
You agree that those are objective measures, correct? Like we can say a person that has more children than another person, like that's measurable. That's an objective fact.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I agree that that's a measurable fact, but the assumption there is that because like by definition of what subjective morality is, your assumption is that from that is claim of, say, evolution tells us that we are driven by the urge to reproduce and survive, and basically we have the urge to survive to reproduce. So we're driven by that, but therefore we ought to do X, Y, and Z to achieve that goal. But that goal doesn't actually say that that moral stance of that ought claim becomes objective. So like, for example, I'm trying to think of an example here. So like, I'm sure you've heard this one before, so you might have a response to it, but let's say someone's put into society that the only possible method for them to reproduce is they have to rape someone. Mm-hmm. They have to go through the act of rape. Don't they? And
Drew's laughing.
It's like a shock value,
so
okay?
Adam hates this so much because every time this
that's their only possibility. Tell me a little bit about why that's their only possibility.
That's not the only one. That's just like the one I want to start with to like kind of get your position on it. Mm-hmm. So so like they're driven to rape.
They don't know how to dance. They're not a good dancer.
Nope. This is the part of the thought experiment. You can't add stuff in, right? Uh-huh. So they're driven to do that. So why would it be like, would it become objectively, like the objective moral statement is that it's okay for them to rape because they need to fulfill the goal that is part of evolution?
Well, they would be killed and the goal would be subverted.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, that's a big assumption.
This is what I'm saying. Okay. There are, if the social norm for a group is rape is okay, like what society has the social norm that rape is okay? Can you cite an example, an empirical example?
So so like that's why I almost hesitated to use the example, because I knew.
Well, if there's no example in the real world, we're talking about behavior. Like, wouldn't it be great if birds sewed sweaters? Okay. Right. Is it moral for birds to sew sweaters? Well, who cares? Birds don't sew sweaters. They can't sew sweaters. That behavior has never evolved in birds. Like you're saying you're creating behaviors that have never evolved in human beings, and say, is this right, justified for people to act on this behavior that hasn't evolved?
Right. So like the overall point is like you're taking. So like I think you're assuming that you're getting through the is-ought divide here, mm-hmm. because you're taking like a statement of what it is, and then you're like assuming that we ought to follow that. Like there's no like observation, because that's just changing the definition of objective and subjective. And so like the overall point would be that you're kind of trying to create this ought statement that is objective, right? I'm
only saying the ought statement is subjective because we don't have all of the variables. That if we had all of the, the disagreement where we perceive something as being subjective in an ought statement is because we don't know the outcome. But once we know the outcome, then that subjectivity disappears. Like if you like take your heinous rape example, okay? This poor guy who convinces himself, oh, it's my only option, right? Like there is so much downside there and so little upside that we can often infer that that's a horrible strategy. Sure, maybe if 1 in 10,000 trials produces a good I'm trying to think how the good outcome is. You would infer that is a bad strategy. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's a subjective strategy until you know the outcome of it, and then it becomes completely objective.
So I'll try to like rephrase this again, because maybe I'm just explaining it poorly, which is very plausible. So like what you're doing, so you're taking the is statement, but like let's say you're starting with the ought statement and then you're going to like is because like we want to reproduce. So we ought to follow, if we had all the variables and all this, that ought would become objective.
Right.
Right. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. So like the problem with that is you're assuming that like the universe is telling us that it is like morally good. It is a good thing. It's a true thing that we should reproduce, but there is nothing that is telling us that necessarily. Just because the universe is doing it, we're inserting this value judgment upon what that is, if that makes sense. So you're trying to make like an axiom off of an ought statement. Do you get what I'm saying?
Well, if you play the inverse, it gets ridiculous pretty quickly, because you're saying, okay, there's these two types of behaviors. There's one behavior that's terrible for your genes and your longevity and your society and your evolutionary drive, okay? And you're saying that in order for morality to be subjective, picking the path, the behavior that is less likely to produce what your biology has evolved to do is going to be like, why would you ever pick that path? Why would you pick pain, suffering, disease, death, those kinds of things over health and well-being?
Right. I mean, so my position doesn't say that I can't make claims regarding that. Like I can still make arguments, because that's like the kind of the misconception is that subjective morality automatically equals, it kind of feels like you're describing maybe not necessarily, but moral relativism to an extent where, you know, we can't really like critique various moral systems and discuss like what we should do as a society and what we should work towards, blah, 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 blah. The point, like there's, what's kind of the word? It's like, I think it's called moral constructivism, where it's like you still go out and you try to critique things, but you kind of accept that there's like this no grounding of this objective morality, such as to reproduce. And the other issue is, okay, so like, let's say you want to take your objective morality to reproduce. Like, even if you knew all the facts, that doesn't create it to be the case that we should do that. Like we don't have like this, judgment or this value that it must be the case that we should continue to exist. Right now, we can argue like
that's why it gets ridiculous, because it's like you're saying, okay, we have two options here: to exist or not to exist. And it's subjective that we just so happen to choose to exist. Yet we choose to exist every single time, over and over and over again. Like if you, the only people who opt out on and take the other side of that equation are ones that are going to engage in huge amounts of suffering, and they do it to avoid the suffering, which still makes the argument that people are against suffering, that well-being is more important than suffering or pain.
Right, but then you just added a new kind of like moral claim on there that we should follow, but that one's subjective. So like in the other example, let me think of a better thought example.
What is subjective about
it? Which part? Sorry.
What did I add on that was subjective? What moral claim?
So basically you started with this idea that we are driven to reproduce and like that idea, right? So then you added, okay, but we also want to decrease human suffering. But how do we ground that in objective morality?
Well, I thought of an example that's better than the rape example. There's the polygamy example, because some societies have chosen polygamy. Now, polygamy is definitely good for high status males. 20% of the males are going to produce all of the offspring, and 80% of the males are going to not reproduce or be forced to look elsewhere for reproductive advantage. All of those males are still in the marriage market. They're all looking, just despite it being completely subjective, they're all looking for this reproductive advantage. So I could see where there is some subjectivity in what, like, different players within that community are going to want different things, because those different things are going to produce more reproductive advantage for some people and less reproductive advantage for other people's. But they're still working on the same objective goal, to survive and reproduce. So it seems like the goal there is objective. The subjective part is the strategy. But once you hammer out a strategy, even that becomes objective, because do you want to live in a society where 80% of the males are locked out of the marriage market, or is it better to institute some institution like monogamy, where you have basically a 1-to-1 with marriage partners?
Right. Okay. So I kind of want to build off that polygamy example, because it's like, okay, so that one's kind of like an example that we can see. But like, okay, let's take your goal of reproduction and like maximize it. Like, the goal is to reproduce. Human suffering then can't matter. Like, that's just kind of subjective, and we don't need to worry about that. Let's kind of use like those terms. Would you accept that in a way?
Well, not necessarily, because there is going to be a point where reproduction, I mean, you're finding this balance. There is going to be a point where reproduction, like, reduces well-being, where more offspring will reduce quality of life and even potentially cause death and destruction. So
I'm trying to create the distinction where what you're seeing is you're trying to like kind of like shift it here, where, well, like, there's a balance, and then within that balance there's a lot of subjectivity. So like, imagine a society where they decided the goal, like the objective moral goal that they ought to strive for, is reproduction. Like, that is it. Like, that is what we need to do by necessary. Everything else is cast aside. Right. And so what they do is they decide to set up basically like sex factories. People don't even have sex. They just, when a male hits puberty, they collect the sperm and they inseminate the women, and they just make sure society continues to populate. But for our human intuition, and what we would probably want, I'm not saying it needs to be certain or anything like that, we would probably find issue with that type of society, right?
I don't know, maybe.
So like, my point is that you can like shift around that goal, and people start wanting to say like, that can't be morally like objective the case, because we wouldn't like that, or our feelings and our preferences and our desires would not align with that form of objective moral standard. So then you start realizing, okay, although we are driven with our desires to, let's say, reproduce, that doesn't mean that we ought to do that. There's other things and other desires and other feelings we have about the world, or what the world should look like, that we insert in subjectively. So you can subjectively claim that we ought to reproduce. And it might be the case that a lot of our desires, are driven by this desire to reproduce, but it doesn't make it the case that we ought to reproduce. I'm trying to like show you that is a problem with that example.
Well, everything seems completely objective to me, and it seems like you're placing items in the subjective category that would always be bad for somebody else's fitness. So in order to create a subjective category where you have choices, like, we're not talking about, vanilla versus chocolate here. We're talking about, rape versus marriage. Okay. Yeah. So, but you understand that in the case of rape, your fitness is at the expense of somebody else's fitness, correct? And in the case of marriage, your fitness and someone else's fitness are aligned. Now, I'm making the case that when people's fitness is aligned and aimed towards well-being, that those things we always call moral, objectively. We can measure them just like the case of the diamond. Diamonds have value because they give people a sexual selection advantage. A guy with 10 diamonds to hand out versus a guy that has 0 diamonds to hand out is going to be in a better marriage market. Do we disagree there? Does that seem like a subjective thing?
That does seem like a subjective thing because that is a cultural thing.
Right.
You get what I mean?
Right.
So that like that's what I mean. Like if just because we agree as a society, because that's not always been the case. Like diamonds have never always been this like big thing to do. Like the diamond market that's a story for another day, but it's a crazy corrupt thing that they've really driven people to go and desire diamonds for marriage. But that's kind of the overall point. Like right now, sure, that's what works. That's what you ought to do to achieve if your desire is to get into a marriage to reproduce. If that's your desire. Not even saying that's your desire. But the point is like your claim that becomes objective if all of a sudden as a society we agree, just because as a society that we agree upon something, it doesn't make it objective. Because like in that case, like one person would decide that, okay, diamonds they're actually not how I have this mate that I want to attract, and she actually just despises diamonds. All of a sudden, if she despises it, it just destroys the objectivity of diamonds being necessary.
It doesn't change the value of the diamond, because you could sell the diamond because the diamond has value in its sexual selection. It has a value as a sexual selection advantage that you could cash in for cash and trade in for whatever object this woman desires for her sexual selection advantage. Okay.
Right. Okay. So,
but what I'm saying is there are a few women out there that value things that aren't valuable. I mean, even if it's something that you're going to make yourself, it's going to show that you are a smarter individual. It's going to give all these sexual selection cues that the diamond may not have given that would be more valuable. But it's still being related back to evolution. It's still being related back to sexual selection and inclusive fitness.
So like the first point is like the diamond example. And this is how we can distinguish that it's not objectively valuable. Because if all humans disappeared, the value of diamonds would disappear. Like that is something we inserted a story that diamonds are this nice shiny object. They're kind of rare. They're actually not that rare, but the market makes them rare. And we desire to use this to achieve said goal. Well, but that doesn't mean that the diamonds are objectively valuable. We've inserted value in there. That's like defining what subjectivity is regarding value.
We've asserted a different type of value, but the diamonds would still have value in just their physical components. Like maybe a diamond is good for some technological development that is not necessarily. I mean, the diamond still has value, even if human beings are not, in just its properties, what it can do.
Right. I mean, with that standard, pretty much you could figure out anything can have value to some extent. And then
that's the whole idea of objectivity.
Objectively moral in some sense, if you can frame it to fit your subjective moral stance. That's kind of the overall problem. Is you're trying to like think how to word this.
Isn't subjective somewhat arbitrary though? I mean, isn't subjectivity just means basically arbitrary?
Not necessarily. It can to an extent. Yes, it's like it's like subjectivity, it's based on the individuals, and individuals are driven by desire, and but that doesn't necessarily make them arbitrary, because the reason that morality isn't objective, and kind of building off what you just said there. So the reason morality isn't objective is because it's still, at the end of the day, like let's say we agree on an objective moral standard, right?
Okay.
And it requires each individuals to take their subjective moral stances of values, and those values of like the values they have that they think that will achieve their desires. They take that and they try to insert it, and they say, oh, I agree with X, Y, and Z person that seems to share my core values and my subjective morality. And then you try to raise that up and proclaim that is objective morality. But someone can come in and say, well, I actually don't have those preferences. I don't have those desires. Does that destroy then your standard of objective morality?
Well, you're saying there are people though that don't have the desire to flourish. And I'm saying citation needed. Like, who are those people?
So, I mean, if someone goes throughout their whole life and never reproduces, technically it would kind of break that. But that's
you
not
can
my
still
overall
go.
point,
You can
though.
still go to the extreme of them not wanting to die, and a lot of times when people do want to die, it's because they don't have any reproductive opportunities. They're living a terrible life. They're in pain. They're suffering, and they don't have reproductive opportunities, which is a problem in and of itself. So.
Yeah. So maybe we need to go back to a little bit more foundationally.
Well, you keep saying desire, and I keep thinking, okay, well, the desire is always the same. Like if people want money, they want money because money brings sexual selection advantage.
Right, but it doesn't make the values they hold objective.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're assuming that
sorry, go
like
ahead.
so like you're still taking. You haven't really explained to me how saying that we are driven by our desire to reproduce, how you can go from that is to an ought. You know what I'm saying? Like that's just part of like the way we reason and logic. That's what we've kind of accepted and figured out. Like Bertrand Russell goes back to that.
So here's the strategy, okay? Once you say and I'm not so clear on you're saying the goal is an is statement. The desire to reproduce is an is statement because it's objective. We're saying objectively people would rather reproduce than not reproduce. People would rather have a loving, loyal, good-looking mate than not have anybody and be forced to go it alone. People would much rather be healthy and active than wheelchair bound and unhealthy. Correct? I mean, are there people that choose the other side of that equation regularly enough for us to say that those are subjective goals of people? If we can agree that that happens so rarely that it's some sort of mental illness, that people would much rather be wealthier, healthier, freer, all of these different things. We agree that's what people desire. That's the direction people want to go. Then our haggling over morality is really what is the best way to achieve those goals. And I think different cultures come to different solutions for achieving those goals. And it's easy to look out into the world and say, okay, there's all these different solutions. But really, if you look close enough, they're all working towards the same goal. They just have different ways of doing it. But since those different strategies for achieving these ends cannot be arbitrary, because if you chose arbitrary paths, you wouldn't actually achieve the ends.
But you just admitted that these other cultures have chosen. So I think you're kind of mentioning, and it's been like 5 years since I've read it, but The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, right? He kind of alludes to this idea of like there's these basic principles. I don't even know if the right word's principles. These basic moral ideas that we all seem to follow.
Moral foundations.
Yeah, moral foundations that we seem to follow. Just because we follow those, it doesn't make it the case that we ought to follow those. Yeah, like just because
I'm trying to get to the. You keep saying it doesn't mean that we ought to follow them. What is the other? What is the reason why we ought not to follow them?
So like it's more getting to the point of the foundation of objective morality versus subjective morality. I would probably concede that, yeah, you should probably follow some of those. But like the point is like those cultures differed about how to achieve the goal they desired. They had these original desires. They had the reproduce foundational point there, and maybe that's what motivated them. But then you think of different methods. The different values and judgments and methods to achieve that goal is when subjectivity gets inserted. like my point is, I guess I kind of disagree with you that we'll ever have it the case that we'll have this perfect system that will always optimally reach whatever goal, because people as individuals have subjective preferences to some extent on how to achieve those goals. You can give them all the information in the world, everything, and they will still, unless you're controlling their mind, and maybe that's a different discussion.
They have different ideas on what strategies will be effective.
Right. My point is, there will never be the case that we will have like this like objective standard to achieve that goal. And that's just trying to give you the fact that we can build off of reproduction being some moral statement. Because it's kind of, it's odd for me to say that it's right to follow that we should reproduce. Like that's just like odd to me. Like I don't feel like I didn't like achieve any moral glory in some sense. It's more of like the principle of decreasing unnecessary human suffering. Like going out and trying to achieve that goal, he would probably agree that that's a subjective goal, right?
Decrease human suffering?
Yeah, like
no,
unnecessary human suffering. Because yeah, it's subjective, right? So like, let's say that's my goal.
It's objective, because you can tell if you're like, this is why I believe in objective morality, because if you measure, like there are certain objective facts about societies. The suicide rate, like, is an objective fact. I don't know how you could say it's not. We can measure it from nation to nation. We can measure it from society to society. If you had a society where the suicide rate was 50%, I'd say they're probably doing something wrong.
So, but it's still, you're inserting an assumption there. Like, this is the case that people are committing suicide. Mm-hmm. So it must be the case that they're not minimizing human suffering. And we can observe that and say, yeah, you're probably right, but it doesn't make it the case that they're objectively.
I would argue that the suicide rate is high because they are. I believe people are committing suicide because they're trying to increase human well-being. They're saying, I'm in a terrible situation. I have no well-being at all. I'm going to end my life because my well-being sucks so bad. So I think a high suicide rate is actually.
Do you see how you're inserting your value judgment there?
Well, there's a collective value judgment, though, that I don't think you're necessarily acknowledging. You can come into a situation. You can say subjectively, murder is my thing. I love killing people. Like that's my gig. I say killing people is moral. That's the moral way to be. But you still have society as a feature of the natural world pushing back against you.
Right. Okay. But so the point is like you're basically taking this collective approach, right? And you're saying, okay, because we agree on this moral standard, which it's really, I would even question if we can observe that correctly, but observing this moral standard that we're all following. Mm-hmm. The point is like, we can say that, but that's still subjective morality. Like just because we agree on this method or this way or this value judgment, it doesn't make it the case that it's objective part of the universe that we can observe, that we can calculate. Like, how do you calculate if we should, like, that's kind of my main point is like, I think you're assuming too much that these standards to measure things. And then also the fact that the collective all of a sudden makes it objective. That's just not the way we define objectivity and subjectivity, because of agreement.
Are the rules of baseball objective or subjective?
Okay. So like, that's okay. This is where example we can build off of. So the rules of baseball are objective.
Okay. We agree.
No, sorry.
They're subjective.
They're subjective.
How can you even play a game if they're subjective?
They're subjective because everyone agrees they want to play baseball. Mm-hmm. They agree upon rules, but those rules are still subjective. They could be changed. Like they could be altered. Like baseball has a history of changing rules. Basketball has a history of changing rules. They're not set in stone. They're not objective. They're not part of the universe. They're created by us. So we subjectively insert rules that we find to be the best way to achieve the goal of playing baseball.
The changing of the rules are part of the rules of baseball, and they're completely objective. If the rules of baseball were subjective, we could play a game where I say you're out with one strike, and you say it takes 3 strikes. We can't even play a game without objective rules.
So you're getting caught up on this. Is those are still subjective rules. They're agreeing upon those. Like I pick up basketball, and I'm obviously going to agree upon the rules that everyone agrees upon. That doesn't make it objective. If we stopped existing, the rules of basketball would disappear. Or whatever narrative you created around the evolution of rules of basketball, they will also disappear. That's why they're not objective. That's just by the definition of objective and subjective. And that's my overall point, is you're creating rules to follow to achieve something that is part of the universe, but we have no way to verify that we ought to follow that part of the universe.
It seems to me that
my overall point is that subjectivity and these ought claims, those are a human creation. That's part of our method of storytelling. So it's just by definition, morality is subjective, but it's good to know those things that, like you're talking about, that are objective parts of the universe. But I think people just have a difficult time admitting that morality is subjective, because we see these objective things in science and the way we're built up and the way evolution works. We want to insert ways and try to steer the way evolution goes, but that's an assumption in itself, that we ought to survive, to kind of keep evolution progressing. But the assumption also there is that evolution is progressing. Evolution is just evolving. There's no progression there. So we can't do anything to make evolution better, because the universe does not give a shit.
I think that you're conflating change over time with subjectivity. Because
how so?
Well, you're saying that because the rules of baseball change over time, and that makes them subjective. Lots of things change over time but are still objective.
Even if they didn't change over time, we can take that out. They're still subjective. They're still a human creation, is my point. If humans created them, humans inserted the rules of baseball, for example, the framework of baseball, the rules we should follow, is a subjective value. Like we're saying, this is the rules we value to try to achieve the goal of what we perceive to be the best baseball game. But those rules are subjective. Like, what is the standard for the best baseball game? How do you achieve the best baseball game? What does the universe have to say about the best baseball game?
We have different species of birds that do elaborate dances in order to mate. Are you telling me that because those mating behaviors, are you saying those mating behaviors are subjective in the birds?
Yeah. So, no. So like that's where you're trying to. It's almost like you're trying to insert intelligent design into evolution.
I'm not. I'm not at all. Listen.
But that's what. So
why do the birds? Why do the birds do those elaborate dances?
So they totally do that, probably to reproduce.
Yeah,
not even probably. I'm sure they do.
If they don't do it right, what happens?
So the goal.
No eggs this summer.
Right. But what you're inserting is that means they ought to dance, but they don't even ought to exist.
No, I'm saying, who knows? Like, would a different dance work? If it's subjective, why can't they just do any dance?
So that's the point. This is kind of where I'm definitely not an expert on evolution, but I feel like I know the general idea, probably like most people. But so like the idea is like through evolution, various dances have been tested, right? Like various bird dances, whatever, have been used, and various ones have achieved the goal, right? But does that make those dances, like what if a new dance, a bird decides, like for some reason they have this intuition going that they create a new dance that they're like, I'm going to do it differently than that guy. And they keep like building upon that or changing it or whatever, and all of a sudden that becomes the better standard. If the standard is always changing and it's like based on like the intuition and it's kind of like subjective dance, basically, like how do you measure a great dance? Like we can't measure what the number of grandsons
and by the number of grandsons and granddaughters it produces, and that is an objective fact. And not only that, it's not arbitrary. It's not arbitrary because arbitrary will not necessarily produce the grandsons.
Now take that. I agree with you.
Or
like
granddaughters.
That you can find a dance probably that is objectively going to produce that goal, that end. But why is that end good? Like why ought we to do that? That's the overall point. Like that's where subjective morality comes in. See, all morality is humans saying what we should and should not do. So in the case of the birds, is what you're trying to insert is what the birds should do. But the point is like we can't tell what the birds what they should do.
Well, I see you making basically two separate arguments here. I see you making the argument that the goal is there's always more than one choice of goal, and that's what makes it subjective, and it comes down to personal preference. But I'm making the argument that you can't. It doesn't come down to personal preference because there's an evolutionary basis for it. Either that goal produces well-being, wealth, more survival, or doesn't. Then there's also, once you get past that, and you can't really even move on to step 2 because you're saying, well, there are these other goals. In order to make the goal subjective, away from well-being or flourishing or something like that, you have to tack on another potential goal, which is, what is the other potential goal? Suffering? What is the other goal?
So I'm not saying there's like just a set amount of goals.
Okay. So you're just saying going for the goal that everybody always goes for. That part is subjective. Let's just get past that. We'll set that aside a second. So if we have that goal, you're also saying that the strategy for achieving that goal is subjective. And I'm saying, well, it can't be subjective because it can't be arbitrary. You either achieve the goal or you don't achieve the goal. And obviously there will be good strategies for achieving that goal, and there will be bad strategies for achieving that goal. So the bird dance is one example, because yes, the bird could come up with some better dance that works better for them, but they're risking going with something new when they could go with something that's tried and true.
But still, so like it's still the fact that the goal itself, we are inserting value into the goal, and like I feel like we should replace
what
goal
is the value?
With desire almost. It's like this desire we have. So like my overall point is, so when we say like facts about the universe, like the universe follows the laws of physics. Mm-hmm. That's an is statement. Like we can observe that factually, and it's just the way the universe works. We can also I guess I alluded to this in my opening statement, but we can also like maybe not imagine a universe of this, but like imagine a universe that isn't expanding, or like I said, where humans didn't come from a shared ancestor with chimps. So the point is like when we insert these ought statements, we can continue to say why. Like we keep going back to why. But like parts, like facts about the universe, you can't. Like there's a stopping point. Like our universe, the reality we live in, they follow the laws of physics. You can't go back anymore. But when we talk about, like, for example, the bird dance, they should do X dance to achieve this goal. But why should they achieve the goal? Because they need to reproduce. Well, why should they reproduce? Because they need to live on. But why should they live on? So you see, you can continue to ask why, and there's no end. And when there's no end in that why, that is the subjective nature of it. It's like subjectivity. We don't know this for sure yet, but humans seem to be the ones that most like to do it. It's like this whole creating a narrative thing and all that, and stories to follow and communicate. But the point is, and that's kind of my overall point about morality, is we can observe that too, is that it's built upon just a method to communicate and all this. And it's not like this intrinsic part of the universe, morality itself, by definition, because of the way it works, where you continue to ask why, and you can never latch it on to something intrinsic, a part of the universe.
Well, you seem to be saying that objective things must be some property of the universe, but all subjective means is that there's no truth value, no agreed upon measurement system for something.
So,
but all the things I'm listing do have truth values, and
I feel like we're debating objective truth and subjective truth, because I believe in objective truth. But the point is, I'm trying to get to the fact that we're talking about morality.
Yes.
which is
But you defined it the same way I define it, so we're on the same page.
Right.
Set of rules.
But that's my overall point. You haven't really
behavior.
the rules for behavior but we choose to insert value upon them. We claim that they are good or bad.
Yes, but
right or wrong.
Yes, right or wrong, exactly.
But like I said, it's like going back to the one we keep going back to, reproduction. Why is it the case we should reproduce?
It's fun.
It's fun. So why is it fun?
Well, it's just, I mean, it is. I don't know. It's like,
do you see what I mean?
In my brain, it's good.
I feel like I'm so close to getting you there. It's like, but do you see what I mean though? It's like, you can't go, like you just keep asking why.
Oh, it's objectively fun. It's not, that's not, in no way is that subjective.
But okay, but there is people like asexuals that say, you know what, sex isn't a good time. I don't like it. So what about those people?
They're liars. Let's go to questions. We're at an hour, man. This is a fascinating conversation, but there's three criteria for something being objective. It's that there's truth value to the statement, that there's an agreed upon measurement. So when you run into things like beauty, you don't necessarily have an agreed upon measurement. But I mean, there's evolutionary arguments for why we even find things beautiful, which add a level of objectivity to that kind of thing as well. So I don't necessarily like really, and the reason why I find it interesting to have these conversations is because I'm trying to come upon an agreed upon method. Historically, the disagreement for right and wrong behavior has been because one person's fitness comes at the expense of another. So therefore, the person that has the advantage will say this is moral because it's for my fitness, and the person that has the disadvantage will say this is immoral because it's against my fitness. This generally comes into existence in group-on-group conflict, because obviously we have very different rules for how we treat the outsider than how we treat our people in our group. Like raping the outsider that's like a historical norm. So it's not even considered immoral to rape the outsider.
So maybe this point might get you. So what you kind of just defined for me, you kind of define like these two separate groups, and one finds something moral, the other finds something immoral because it affects whatever goal they have.
Mm-hmm.
But you just kind of described how it's like, it's based on the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the overall point with subjective morality, is that it's based on the individual within those groups. Those groups agreed upon it, but they still agreed upon a subjective goal.
Right. But what you're doing is you're subjectively agreeing to buck the objective norm. Like when you say, I subjectively think that murder is okay, you're saying objectively it's illegal. It's written in a book. Law enforcement is being paid to apprehend me. So those are objective truths. Those are true statements, are they not? When the judge sits down and
you're assuming, so like the assumption that you haven't gotten around, you're assuming that norm is good. Like that is moral and good, and we should do it, and it's valuable. We don't know that. Like the universe does not give us that information. We cannot know for sure. So like I said,
society gives us that information, though. Why do we have to go all the way to the universe?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So okay. So like that's my overall point is like, to me, you just kind of alluded to it there, where society like has this desire for objective morality. I fully admit that. But my point is that we shouldn't desire it, because when we admit to the fact, because like objective morality throughout history has, although you could say like it does unite people, it also causes issues. So there's a conversation to be had if, okay, let's say we accept morality as subjective. Should we tell society, or should we really be pushing society to believe that, because people will think, oh, they're going to go out and rape and all this, blah, blah, blah. But the idea is that once you accept that it's subjective, the morality is subjective, we can start opening the discussion to, okay, what goals do we want to have? Not what the universe is telling us to have. What goals do we want to have? And I don't even know how that's the right phrase to say the universe has goals for us, because that's alluding to the idea that evolution is guided in some way, because that's not the case. But the idea is like we can start discussing goals, and if we want to decrease human suffering, or how we treat others, and should we have rights, and all this type of stuff, we start opening the door to those conversations. Because when you start grounding in an objective, that's when it gets confusing. As okay, so like as that people act as though like once you ground in an it's objective, that somehow these disagreements are going to stop. And I think that says a lot too, that these disagreements have been going on forever. Sure, you can find some shared values here and there that might be part of evolution, but the overall point is there's always these disagreements, but that's okay. Like we want to have these disagreements so we can openly discuss them to figure out what best we should do and what we actually want.
You keep
based on our subjective experience.
You keep switching point of views though between the goal. Like you started off talking about the goal, and then you went into talking about the strategy for achieving the goal, which is where so it's going to be
the goal is subjective. That's my point.
Well, people are going to have subjective views on what is going to be a useful strategy until those strategies are tested. Then it becomes objective. I mean, that's empiricism 101.
So like let's say I say I want to decrease human suffering. And maybe I'm influenced by evolution. That doesn't make it the case that my desire for it, or like that idea that we ought to decrease human suffering, becomes objective. But that's my goal. The goal is subjective. So you can have the point. My point is my goals for what I want as society, what I want for myself, those are subjective. But I agree with you in the sense that maybe we can find objective means to achieve those goals, those desires, those preferences. But the overall point is those goals, I made them up. Like they're mine. And like other individuals have different goals, different preferences, different desires that they subjectively follow.
They have different strategies for achieving the same goal.
I disagree with that.
What Drew, we got to be stacking up questions here. Let's answer some questions, Brendan.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to start with super chats, and then we're going to move to not super chats. All right?
Nice.
So we got
some super chats.
So we do got some super chats, yeah. So first question from the super chat. This is from Sekud Sign. CA $5. I don't even know what that means. Why not a goal where you act immoral to live?
The Genghis Khan.
I feel like that's towards Adam.
The Genghis Khan goal. Well, this is the problem with power differentials, because this is where the morality. People will consult their intuitions oftentimes and say, okay, well, Genghis Khan morality is evolutionarily beneficial for his genes and not for others' genes, and therefore their intuitions are this is immoral. And I agree with them. I think those intuitions are correct that is immoral. But I'm pointing this out, that when Genghis Khan's fitness comes at the expense of other people's fitness, we would generally in the modern era call that immoral. Genghis Khan would have called it moral in his time. But my point is the conversation that we're having about this is in fact objective, because we can objectively measure why this morality of Genghis Khan's comes at the expense of the morality of all the people suffering under Genghis Khan. Those are objective features of the natural world. It's the same example as the birds, the bird dance. It's objective behavior.
You want to respond to that too, Adam or Brendan, or are you good?
I would just say, like, if we find it generally immoral, that's like the pinpoint part there. Where if you just find it generally immoral, you have to admit that there's some subjectivity within it. It means it's not objectively immoral. So it's like, in a way, if we have like general rules, just even general rules are able to be broken because they're just generalized. So that in itself tells you that that's a subjective moral claim.
Well, generalized how? Because there's different forms of enforcement. There's social enforcement and there's legal enforcement. So if you're talking about social enforcement, yes, those rules can be broken, but often you receive a penalty, some sort of social penalty. So you're not really The rules are still objective if people are doling out social penalties because of them.
That goes back to like the baseball example. Those are just rules the society agreed upon. They're still man-made. They're subjective. It's not like
this is the conflation. This is the same conflation you've made before. You're saying because things change over time, that makes them subjective. The amount of oxygen in the atmosphere has changed over time. It's not subjective.
No. That's not my point. Because like I said that, okay, imagine baseball never changed its rules. It's still subjective because they agreed upon those. Those rules do not exist as part of the universe. They're man-made. They're subjective rules that people agree upon. Just because people agree upon them, it doesn't make them objective, because the definition of objective is something that can be proven true or false in relation to the universe.
Is the bird dance part of the universe?
So even that is, we're trying to insert value into the way they bird dance.
Is the bird dance part of the universe?
Is the bird dance part of the universe?
Yes.
Can you imagine a universe where those birds did not have to do a dance to reproduce?
I'm asking you if the bird dance is part of the universe. Yes,
it's part of our universe.
So it is part of our universe. That makes it objective. This is some standard that things that are objective have to be part of the universe.
You're still conflating the objective claims versus moral claims. So like that is an objective part of the universe that the birds dance. Like we can just observe that. Like I give you that point. But then you're going to the next phase.
Well, why is it different when human beings
bird ought to do it? No. So okay, wait. So like you're using an objective claim and then trying to build that objective claim onto an objective moral claim, which you can't do because that's the ought problem. So you're trying to say like the birds, we observe the birds dancing and they do this for, sexual reproduction. But then you're inserting that they ought to dance, that it's good that they dance, that's value, but that they dance. But the assumption again is that they ought to reproduce. And we can't make that claim because that claim is not part of the universe. We can't observe that as true or false. We keep going back to the why thing. Why? It just keeps going off of each other. That's the subjective nature of it.
Next question.
All right. So we got 2 super chats with no questions attached to them, but I'm going to read them anyway. So we got Cult of Malgus for $3, and then we also got Alex Kairos for $10 and a thumbs up.
Thanks,
and then
Alex.
Alex Kairos for another $5 actually asked the question. It says, is existentialism subjective? I mean, we kind of use it for science and living and all that. So I guess this is predicated on you knowing what existentialism is, but he's asking if existentialism is. So.
Brandon, you want to take this? You're the philosophy guy.
Yeah, it's a subjective worldview. I mean, I don't know what else, how they want me to explain it. Like why existentialism is subjective. It's because they observe how we view the world and like the kind of like the meaninglessness, and then we create our meaning. But the desire for us to create that meaning we find value in creating meaning in a meaningless world. That is a subjective value claim. So yes, existentialism is subjective.
Isn't it basically, is existence worth it? Kind of the question of existentialism.
I mean, you could phrase it as that as well, but
it's a lot of
the idea of creating meaning in a meaningless world is.
Yeah, you want to throw something in? You have a minor in philosophy.
I do have a minor in philosophy. Yeah. It's kind of a meme.
Sorry, Drew.
You're good.
What do you want to throw anything on existentialism?
I mean, no, I think I agree with what he said. I mean, the whole philosophy, at least within like my field, like existentialism is very much just trying to find a meaning within the inherent meaninglessness of the universe or something like that. So it's basically by definition subjective.
Whenever I hear the word existentialism, I always hear Morrissey songs in my head. Like I immediately go into a Smiths album. I think of caked mascara like running down a girl's face.
Okay. All right. So next question. So this is like a general question that I've seen from a lot of people. No one specifically asked it to y'all, but I think that it's worth answering. Like 4 or 5 people ask, "What is a Christian-Atheist?"
Well, I don't know why. What do you? Oh, because I threw it in the title.
Yeah.
So I was raised Christian, and I'm an atheist now. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the supernatural. And but I have the same moral intuitions of a Christian. Like when you're raised Christian, you kind of internalize the rights and wrongs of Christianity. So I'm morally a Christian reflexively, and I just feel some duty to my heritage, I think. So I'm
So
real,
those morals you absorbed, are they objective?
well,
Oh,
they are
God.
now. They're part of my biology.
But
How are they
they're
not?
based on
If
your
you could,
preferences. They're based on your preferences, right?
if I lie, my body tortures me. How is that a preference?
That is your preference. If I lie, what if my body doesn't torture me?
Then you've been socialized differently, but it's still an objective measure. You don't think guilt is objective? You don't think guilt is measurable?
That's a distinction I've been somewhat trying to get to. The measurement can be objective of whatever you're trying to measure. Like you can find a way to objectively measure something.
Right.
But the actual thing you're measuring, you can't say that it's moral. Like you can't say that that's like part of the universe.
Well, you can't.
You're measuring
You keep
a
saying that's
subjective
part of
thing.
the universe
You can measure
thing.
subjective things. That's my point. You
I
can
don't
measure
understand the
subjective
part of
points.
the universe thing. I don't understand what you mean by part of the universe.
If we disappeared,
Right.
that what you have there, Christian morality will disappear. It's not part of the universe. We can imagine a world where Christian morality never came up.
Mm-hmm.
That tells you that
there's still a strategy for organizing organisms that exists, whether, I mean, your human organisms or insects.
So that's why I feel like this whole debate I've kind of used the wrong word. It's like no, I'm serious. Like no, organized, like that organized word and goals word. I kind of like have given you that word, but that kind of implies in some sense, and at least maybe you can prove me wrong on this. It makes me feel as though I'm like inserting this like intelligent design of where evolution's going. Like it has like this plan for us, but like that's not the case. And that's kind of the overall point too, is like building it off of evolution. You're kind of just like assuming the goals that evolution has and like assuming the values we should insert based off of that, and that those are good, that because we came up through evolution, that we should just follow what we perceive evolution is doing. Does that make sense?
Well, I don't necessarily understand what you mean by evolution doesn't have a goal, because it very much has a goal. It's to fit organisms to a particular environment. If that environment changes, then it retools the organisms to whatever environment they find themselves in. It's like a co-authorship thing. But you seem to be implying that this process, because it's meaningless, means that it's subjective, but I don't necessarily think that it is.
So it is meaningless because we're inserting value upon it. Like it is the case that evolution exists, but we can't derive from, because it's like this whole time we have not come over the is-ought problem. We can't derive that we ought to do something based on that is. Like you're finding value in that is, but that's another ought claim.
I think the
point is
ought thing confuses people.
Ought claims are inherently subjective. Like that's something we can't get around. Like that's one thing philosophers agree on, is like the is-ought problem. No matter what Sam Harris says, the is-ought problem has not been overcome.
Tom Jump thinks he got over it too.
Drew,
who does?
That's a separate conversation.
You're saying the ought is always subjective. How you the course of action someone should take is always subjective.
What they value is always subjective. See, the course of action there is you're building off of a already ought statement. So the ought statement is subjective, but your course of action to achieve that ought statement can be objective, but that doesn't make that ought statement objective. You're assuming the ought statement, and then from that assumption, which we all make assumptions, like I make assumptions in my ought statements too, fully admit that. But from that ought statement, we can go out in the world and, borrow from science to determine, what's the best way to achieve my ought statement. So like maybe let's say I want to be super rich. Like my ought statement is I find value in being rich. Like I think that's what's going to make me feel good. I'm not going to suffer. Like that's just what I want to do. we can try to determine what is the way to do that for me. But that doesn't make the ought statement like part of the universe. It's just me like creating it. Like, sure, it's influenced by things that are part of the universe, but the actual ought statement right there at the beginning is still not part of the universe. It's kind of created from all these other things. It's like the assumption that we rely upon is those ought statements, but we have to do it to coexist as a society. At least from what we can observe so far.
It's funny that you chose to be rich and not tortured in someone's basement for their own amusement.
I'm also not doing very well at the rich part either. So
it's funny. It's funny that these things seem so subjective. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Sunbro asks, so Genghis Khan is the best man to ever live since he reproduced more than any other man.
I should have caught that one. Yeah.
That's
kind of an objection.
But the framework that we're talking about, though, is still objective. It's very much objective. We can say that this reproductive strategy worked for him for this, and this reason, and it came at the expense of these many people. And we can weigh those different factors in a very objective way. It doesn't make the moral system subjective.
No, but like that's not a moral system. So you're observing, like you're taking something you want to measure and you're observing if he achieved that. But you're not actually inserting a moral statement that he should have done that. Like you're assuming the reproduction thing again. That's the assumption. And we can't verify that either, that it ought to be the case that we reproduce. That's like my overall point.
Right.
Because then you're also like, it goes back to the why. I feel like you're really close. Like
why do so many people pick the ought to reproduce and so few pick the ought to not reproduce?
It's a great question.
Can we measure the two groups against one another?
It is the case because of evolution, but still, like maybe we just need a new definition for objective morality. Like that's a discussion for another day. But the way we define subjective morality, which admittedly it is very much somewhat old language still from religious language, but like that, the idea of morality, that's the part that you haven't really got. You're making objective claims and objective claims on how to measure something, but you're not really making moral claims of like why we ought to do it.
I can't wait to go out and tell those birds that their dance is subjective. Let's go for another 10 minutes, Drew. We're running late today, so.
Okay, yeah, all right. So I've got a question that we're going to end on later, but I'm going to save that one for the end. That one's spicy.
Oh, no.
All right. Cult of Malgus asks, you think humans are going to replace God with the government like they did in North Korea, USSR, and China, looking at the state as a deity?
No. I don't believe that.
I mean, I hope not, but I can imagine that it could happen.
I think North Korea is a situation like Genghis Khan, where the fitness of the elites comes at the expense of the greater society. And I think that is a society that's not going to grow and innovate and will be they're already kind of subjugated to our will. So they could all live better lives if they join the modern world.
Okay. Ran45 asks, if suffering is immoral, is it then moral to painlessly kill all life, no suffering?
No. Oh wait, is it moral or immoral? I would say that's immoral.
Can you repeat that question?
Yes, I would say that's immoral. Is that the spicy question?
I would say it's immoral.
It's immoral?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yes, I can make that believing in subjective morality.
Well, it would be the same system I laid out before. You would be subjugating other people's fitness for your own pleasure, I guess. Why someone would make that decision? Well, there are really weird reasons why, because people do that. There are like nihilists that want to destroy a lot of people, but they gain notoriety, which notoriety is actually reproductively advantageous and can be reproductively advantageous for offspring. There's a guy that actually goes around claiming he's the son of Charles Manson. And I can imagine it gives him some reproductive advantage, but.
Okay. Brendan, this is from Joseph Kirby. Does Brendan believe that rape is subjectively wrong?
That's so when you, Adam, when you get frustrated with that, with my original one, I get frustrated with that one. So like, so I can say, based on my worldview, I want to call rape wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And it is wrong for me, and I think society should call it wrong, and we should punish it. That's kind of where the kind of like moral conceptualism or whatever I said before comes in, is where you can still critique other societies and how they operate in society and what they call moral. So yes, I can still call moral wrong, but I admit that it's a subjective preference that society has created.
Okay. All right. Sunborough asks, Adam, how do you explain the obesity rate if health/reproduction are of primary importance?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Fair.
People. I mean, I would break this down by the strategy thing, because it's really there's the goal, which is health and fitness, and then there's the strategy, and there's obviously a divergent strategy going on when you're eating so much that you're becoming obese, but the strategy is still, or the goal is still the same for health and fitness, but obviously you're deploying a bad strategy. And you could even, I mean, it even fits into the objective, subjective, moral claim that I'm making here, because you could measure this kind of stuff. Like, why are you eating so much? That's an objective measurement.
All right. Let's see. This is from Habakkuk. Brendan, would you consider mathematics subjective?
So that's an interesting one. I've like tried to think about this because I'd never studied math or anything, but so it's like, it's like we've inserted ways to properly measure objective parts of the universe, from my understanding. So in a sense, it is, I guess it would be subjective.
Oh
but yeah, I'm not gonna. But like,
Brendan, everything is subjective with you. I figured it out.
I'm not a good one to answer that question. But so like the basics is that yes, there's ways that we measure the world. It's like, I don't know, I guess they would be objective. It's just, that's not like a moral position though. That's just a way to talk about measurements, which I actually agree with the way Adam talks about those. So we're not in disagreement there. That's not like a moral position. So yes, they're objective. Mathematics is objective.
Okay. We have a super chat from Just Mercy for $2. I'm not sure what this means. Maybe I'm missing something. So what is the benefit of non-user groups?
Anonymous user groups?
Maybe that's what that means.
What is the benefit of anonymous user groups?
Yeah.
I mean, you can behave without any social repercussion. Like in the case, I mean, we've laid out examples in this talk about how if you do things that people find immoral, you're likely to get a social penalty. If you're anonymous, you'll be able to do things that are immoral and not face that social penalty. You might enjoy doing that for your own gain. But as I've laid out, I think morality, where things get tricky with morality, is when somebody's fitness comes at the expense of another person's fitness. And this is what we would call immoral.
Okay. Let's see. We have a question from Cultimagus again. Do you think that outside of trade and sharing of genetic makeup through reproduction, that the world would be a more chaotic or safe place for humans staying in smaller tribes based on past trends of empire?
There's an argument to be made. I know there's a book about it that it's on my reading list. I haven't read it, but it makes the claim that tribes were actually happier. So if your goal is to be happy, that the tribes actually lived happier, more peaceful lives. So maybe you can make that claim, but not willing to assert that that's my position.
Okay. All right. How many more questions do you want to do?
There's a potential trade-off there, and I think it does come down to the goal strategy divide, because you could, like, there's an example that people often do where they measure a life lived with a steady stream of happiness compared to a life where you struggle, and then at the very end achieve an epic goal. And people would much rather live the second life, where the majority of their life is spent in suffering, even though they achieve something that they feel is very satisfactory, than a moderate life of happiness. So that is really kind of the strategy versus goal thing, because you're still after the same goal. You're after a measure of satisfaction, of fitness, but you've got two different strategies. And I think most of our haggling comes down to whether or not it's one strategy is good or another. And I think people conflate these different strategies as being subjective, but one strategy ultimately wins out over another strategy, and that's why I am claiming that they are objective and non-arbitrary. So let's do, are there any more questions? Was that the last spicy one, or you want to throw out the spicy one?
So yeah, I'll throw out the spicy one. This is just the last one.
Brendan, before we do the last question, do you want to say anything before we go? Do you want to have a closing argument or anything?
I think we said everything.
You seem so frustrated. I just know it's subjective. It's totally subjective. You at least understand my argument.
Okay. I guess I have. Yeah, I completely understand your argument. I just think you're conflating objective claims and objective morality.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if I can close my statement with like another maybe thought example to maybe this.
Oh no, here it comes. How many people get raped in this example?
So let's say, so like we have societies that, let's say the reproduction is really what we're motivated by. Like that's the objective goal, right? So if a society, like we have examples of societies where the headhunters, where they would cut off people's heads, right?
Costly externalities.
And you could probably connect that to in that tribe, in that society that helped them reproduce and helped the tribe grow and built something, whatever. Do you say that's good? That's objectively good that they did that?
No, terrible. Their fitness is coming because their fitness is coming at the cost of other people's fitness.
Okay, so
the people that get their heads on a pike.
Right. But that's another moral claim. The goal is reproduction. The individual is achieving that. The ones that went out. Yeah. They're achieving that, right?
Yes, we have a difference on strategy.
So they achieved that moral goal. So if they have a different strategy, that's my point though. That's the subjectivity. Where's the objective part? You can't say that what they did is bad. That's my point.
Everything we're measuring though, like we can jump back and forth in perspective. Sure, it wasn't bad for them. It increased their inclusive fitness. You know, they got a rankings boost inside their tribe. Now they're high status. Right. These heads are going like diamonds here in this tribe, man. Every girl wants a guy with a head, right? But those costly externalities are being foisted onto an outside population. Now that outside population, I would hazard a guess, would say that what the other tribe is doing is immoral because it hurts my fitness.
Right. Yes. So why does your fitness matter?
But this arrangement that I've articulated here, where one person's fitness comes at the cost of another person's fitness, how is that subjective?
That's a moral claim. So like what? Like they achieve the ones that successfully.
Why are you laughing, Drew?
The person that successfully headhunted. Right?
Yes.
They achieved their moral goal. So by your definition of morality, objective morality of reproduction, they achieved it. So they are acting good. Like they are moral beings.
No, they're not. I'm not. You're the moral subjectivist here, okay? You're the moral subjectivist, okay? Let me get this straight. I'm the moral objectivist, okay?
Yes.
You're the one that's saying it's good because they achieved their...
No.
Okay, you're not saying it's good?
I'm not saying we should just allow people to go achieve their goals. I'm saying their goals are objective.
I'm saying their goals are objective. You're saying they're subjective.
Okay, but why didn't that headhunter achieve his objective goal?
He did, but he did in a system that put.
So why is he not good? Why is he immoral? So like by the standard of an objective goal, if someone achieves
for the same reason blood diamonds are bad. For the same reason blood diamonds are bad, because they come at the expense of other people's fitness.
One last point. So you said, okay, the tribe that successfully collected heads, they were just rolling in the diamond heads, basically.
Yes.
And then the other tribe,
we just need to get them on the diamond market.
That has like all their heads are gone. They just got a bunch of women and a couple men left because all their heads are cut off. You said they would think the other tribe is immoral, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how can you say that? Like, why are they able to say that?
I'm able to say that. They're not able to say that.
You're able to say that because you're using your moral subjective claim. That's why you can say it.
I'm using an objective claim.
I don't know if we're not going to get there.
Okay, you want to move on to the question?
Yeah, the spicy question. Come on.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, here we
talk
go.
is way too long. Nobody's going to be able to take it.
All right, guys. Y'all ready for the big shebang here?
Let's hear it.
Best question that was asked. Objectively true that this is the best question that was asked. All right, this is from Brian. If you join a cult that worshipped 4chan memes as the highest virtue and henceforth identified as a memer with the pronouns he, him, meme, would edgy memes become objective morality in your secret society?
Yes.
Oh man, that's a creative
Good to know.
question.
Yeah, they're measurable. All objective means is measurable by an agreed upon metric. That's all it means.
That's a subjective metric.
Okay.
Because you're agreeing upon it.
I'm dying for Brendan to come out with his subjective ruler. It's a subjective ruler. It's a rule. I can imagine the ruler, okay, where it has like a little string in there, and you can make the inch like whatever size you want. It shrinks them down proportionally. As you pull the string out, you're like, this is the perfect subjective ruler. How long do you want a foot to be?
Why?
How long do you want?
Why measuring that society that way? Why is that good? You can't answer why it's good.
But because the measurement is fitness. Yes, you can. The objective measure is fitness for the most people. This is why the headhunters is bad. It's always been that way. Like that's always been the metric. Yes, bringing more people together into society, you're going to have a stronger society.
That's
objectively,
an observation.
I realize this is subjective, but if you have two tribes, you have a tribe of 10 people and a tribe of 100 people, and they go to war, who are you putting your money on?
The 100.
Yeah, because they're gonna just slaughter them. It's like, come on.
Yeah, but why is it good that they win?
Well, if you have 100 people, is more difficult to organize, more difficult to stay together, more difficult to reduce conflict in than 10 people.
Right, but that doesn't make it good. Like, just because you might be right about that way to measure it doesn't mean the overall thing we're trying to measure is good.
Make it good if good is tied to fitness for the most number of people. It does make it good.
That's an assumption. That's an assumption. That
it's
is
a
your
measurement.
Assumption that
it's a measurement. Brandon, you could point to a ruler and say this is a subjective measurement because human beings dreamed it up. No, it's an objective measurement because we've agreed upon it.
Has inch always been an inch, like exactly an inch?
Now you're making the same conflation over something changing over time, making it subjective. Things change over time. It doesn't make them subjective. Right now, the oxygen, the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere is different than it was 100 years ago. It doesn't make it subjective how much oxygen is in the atmosphere.
At this moment, yeah, you are 100% right. I never disagree with that point. My point is you're assuming your assumption of what morality is just based on measurements. That's not objective morality.
I feel like Sitch's law has held true once again. That really we're just arguing over definitions here.
Yes, I can fully probably embrace that. Yes. I forgot to mention that in my opening statement. I was like, this is probably going to end up being just a discussion of definitions, but let's give it a go.
Well, this was fun nonetheless. So obviously, thank you so much for your super chats. Thank you for participating in the chat. Thank you for making Drew Welty laugh his ass off through most of this debate. I've seen him chuckling all the way through. If I have time, I'll go back through and I'll read some of your chat. I was trying to concentrate. I had to destroy Brendan here. So do you feel destroyed, Brendan?
No.
Thanks for joining in, guys, and we will see you all. Well, first I got to pull the thing up here. And we will see you all in the next video.